world, become a cognitive psychologist, is only half true. You can rule part of the world. I mean, I guess you could if you really wanted to be, autocratic about your application of neuroscience, but we'll try to be benevolent dictators in our talk today. So this is not really your average career talk. This isn't, hey, look, you can go get a job working for this place or that place. We'll be a little about that later. It'll be less about what kind of jobs you can get than usual, and sort of more focus on the general approach of showing you how critical issues can be approached from a cognitive or neuroscience perspective, in particular a lot of applied issues, and probably a lot that you'd never thought of as being particularly cognitive issues. And the reason I wanted to take this approach is we really need new approaches to a lot of different solutions. And I think psychologists, in particular cognitive psychologists and neuroscientists, because I have no bias at all, I think we really have a unique approach to these things. So I'm going to start off with one of my favorite historical quotes: "The dogmas of the quiet past are inadequate to the stormy present." This comes from Abraham Lincoln's Second State of the Union. And anyone who turns the TV on ever can say this is a very stormy present. And so we can't keep using the same solutions, the same approaches that we have forever. And it doesn't matter what part of our life we're talking about, whether it's education, whether it's transportation policy, whatever it might be, we have to come up with better solutions. And in fact, that's what you guys are going to do. You guys are the next generation to do this. So it's a great opportunity for me to be able to come and do this. So one of the things I urge you to do is to stop asking yourselves, and this is one thing a lot of people say these days, is don't ask yourself or your kids, what do they want to do? What do they want to be? Ask yourself, what problems do I want to solve? Because that's really the more important question. Because that gets you at, if this is the problem I want to solve, then you figure out how to do that. And so you think about what contribution can I make that I'm interested in? And really, at the end of the day, how can I make something better? And in the end, can I do something I think is important and at some point pay the bills? If you can do both of those good things, please tell me how you do it. Because I can do one or the other, but no, that's not true. So we'll talk a little bit about the kinds of jobs that you could probably look for. And I don't have job ads at the end of this, but I can point you in some directions that I know people have worked in. So that's what I think is more important. So you guys all have great critical thinking skills. You can pick apart a problem, and that's one of the things we're going to do today, is pick apart a few problems that you probably never thought of as being that cognitive or neuroscience related. So find an issue, figure out how your skills and knowledge can improve a slice of the problem. We can't solve the entire world's problems on our own, but you can pick a corner of it and make that corner your own. And I think that's one of the things that's important. So most important issues really require massive interdisciplinary work to make a difference. And that's why every university in the country has focused on interdisciplinary work, because that's where the meat is. Because we can all silo ourselves off, but if we don't work together to try to solve some important problems, we'll never get there. So almost every core problem or issue has a cognitive or neuroscience component. And I've yet to find one that I can't find a cognitive component. So if you can think of one, I'll see if I can come up with one. So today I'm going to talk about issues that I've worked on. We'll start there and use a few case studies in other areas that I haven't worked on but I find interesting to show ways in which cognition applies to pressing public policy issues. So we'll start with a couple of things I've worked on. So there was that one time that Gabe and I tried to get people to stop smoking. So chief complaint, I sighed because we kept trying to get funding to keep getting this research going. Chief complaint of smokers is that if they're trying to quit, they have difficulty concentrating, they feel fuzzy-headed. So we conducted a series of experiments testing cognition in abstinent smokers. We take people that smoke heavily, have them not smoke for 24 hours, and then test their cognition. And we found significant reductions in attention and memory performance, particularly sustained attention in abstinent smokers. Pretty strong finding across the board. If you want to know more about that research, you should come to my talk tomorrow, because I'm going to talk all about the data from that tomorrow. But it's an example of a neuroscience talk, or a neuroscience question, that has an important applied component. So if people aren't quitting smoking because they can't get past this fuzzy-headed, difficult memory period, then that's an important question. My father died of lung cancer, so it's an important thing to try to do. Now, it turns out this issue has an even more complex component, because there are specific genotypes that are more susceptible to nicotine addiction, and they respond less to things like varenicline, which is Chantix. Chantix can actually get people through this cognitive slump, as can Wellbutrin. At least some of the data indicates that. But some genotypes don't respond to those pharmacological treatments because of that particular problem. So just an example of one of the kinds of things we've tried to do. Now comes our next disastrous study. So this is a simple example of an applied cognitive neuroscience question. So then I got into an argument with the Daily Beast and Newsweek, which turned into a paper that required 5 revisions. Was it 5 or 6? So we ran an experiment trying to show the Daily Beast how wrong they were. So here's what happened. Those of you familiar, were you guys all familiar with the TV show Will and Grace? Sean Hayes, who played Jack McFarlane, was in Promises, Promises on Broadway. And this guy from Daily Beast wrote a column saying that an out gay actor couldn't convincingly play a straight role. And I thought, well, that's a testable hypothesis. So we designed an experiment. And what we did is we had 370 undergraduate students assigned to 3 different conditions. They all watched the same video of one of my former students doing a monologue. And a third of them got a Facebook page saying that the actor was gay, another one that he was straight, and another one didn't say anything. And here's what we found. No effect, you guys probably can't read this from back there, no effect on actors' performance across the board. No effect on whether or not they would cast them for a role. Some effects on attractiveness, but that was just simple gender bias. The only difference we got is our gay actor was called less masculine, but that was it. There were no differences in casting decisions. But trying to convince a journal to buy our results was difficult. It took us a while, but we finally got this published, so you can read more about that if you want. But again, another example of a news story that caught my interest that I said, you know what, I don't believe that's true, and we can design an experiment to test that. And at its core, this is another cognitive question because this is about decision making, this is about stereotyping, this is about perception. All of this has to do with cognitive processes. So, the point? As an academic, you have some freedom to look into these issues. So, academic jobs are certainly a part of how you can do this. But you don't have to be an academic to do these things. There are lots of applied questions that you can take and apply your trade in, and it's getting harder and harder to be an academic. And frankly, this publish or perish world of academia sometimes stifles innovation because you have to publish a lot of things, you have to be safe, and so sometimes in order to innovate, it might be better to be in the private sector. So that decision is one of those things you have to struggle with a little bit, but you can sort of have a lot of leeway depending on which way you want to go. So how did I end up where we are today? Well, we'll pause at my next favorite quote because this applied to me over the last couple of years. This is from Dante's Inferno. I found in the middle of the journey of my life, I came to myself suddenly with no direct way forward, which is kind of how I ended up at Georgetown. We can all talk about how that all happened later. But I got to this point in my life where I really started wanting to do more applied work and answer some bigger questions and focus less on smaller issues. I mean, I could do 400 experiments on the word frequency effect and die of boredom by the time I was 50. Please don't tell Mark. I know Mark finds it great and interesting, but like I'll like who's Mark. So there really is some interesting stuff, but you know, I really want to do some applied work. So the first big question I want us to sort of dial down in is just health and wellness. And at its core, all sort of healthcare research is cognitive because what we're talking about is behavior change. But really, we're talking about trying to get people to make different decisions. So how do we get people to make healthier decisions or think differently about health and wellness? One of the ways in which we can look at this is just by simply looking at some of the neuroscience research on aversion and reward. They call this neuroeconomics, but it's just cognitive neuroscience to the rest of us. Because economics is just cognition as far as I'm concerned. But again, the economists don't like to hear that. So the mesolimbic pathway, for those of you who are neuroscience students, enhances the motivational properties of cues predictive of rewards. We call this incentive salience because it makes things salient and we're incentivized to go get them. Purchase decisions are driven by this system. So the reward pathway is activated by items purchased, while the aversion system is activated by excessive prices. So there's actually this really clever neuroscience study that showed if you jack up the price on something somebody really wants, it activates this aversion system. In fact, it's almost like a pain response in the insula. So we can actually use this kind of neuroscience research to get people to make healthy choices. By making unhealthy choices more expensive, it makes them more aversive and less rewarding. Which is the reason why cigarettes are so expensive, because we finally discovered that if you make cigarettes expensive, people will smoke less. Now we're starting to get into these questions about whether or not we should make sugar more expensive and fat more expensive. But you get the idea. It's about incentivizing behavior. And this becomes important in a minute when we're going to talk about urban planning. So, before today, I doubt any of you thought that neuroscience had anything to do with urban planning. It turns out it kind of does. And again, we're going to drill down on the problem of wellness. One of the things that's happening is our cities are killing us, quite literally. There's a lot of things about cities that are very unhealthy. So one of the things I think would really benefit this whole process is urban planners, traffic engineers, and a whole lot of other people make the faulty belief that people act rationally. Of course, they've never talked to Dan Ariely. If you have not read Predictably Irrational, you really should. It's a terrific book. People don't act rationally. We know that as cognitive psychologists. We know they've never acted rationally. Why do you think there are casinos? Right? So, worse, they don't believe behavior is even relevant to their work. In fact, if we're going to go through some of these examples that I find just astounding that they never considered the impact of some of their work. So let's start with just a classic example of heuristic decision making. Where is it safer to live, the city or the suburbs? Or to put it more bluntly, where are you more likely to die in a pool of blood? Who thinks it's the city? Well, of course I set you up for this. The suburbs. You know why? You're far more likely to die in a car accident than you are getting shot or stabbed in the inner city. And by living in the suburbs, you have to drive a lot more. So at almost every age range, unintentional death is much higher in the suburbs than it is anywhere else. So the mostly rural areas are where you're most likely to die in a motor vehicle accident, suicide, firearm death. Somewhere in here, accidental firearm death is really high. What's pretty astounding. If you're 65 years or older, you're a little safer in the rural areas, but I guess that's because you're driving less and shooting at people less. I don't know. Not owning any guns, I guess I wouldn't know. But the point is, the cities are actually safer. So why is getting people to live in a place like a city or an urbanized area important? Well, first of all, higher density housing is key to transit success. You guys have tough row with that out here because nobody lives anywhere near anywhere else. I live in Washington, D.C., where even there we have difficulty. The Georgetown University campus is nowhere near public transit because the people that live in Georgetown didn't want any of those people coming to Georgetown. Now, of course, they're desperate for public transit because you can't get anywhere in Georgetown. So it's a major step towards this. So this is where we start talking about things like environmental impacts. We're going to reduce carbon footprints. We have to reduce our dependence on oil. So part of this goal should be to increase things like walking and biking as alternative transportation modalities. Now, how do we get people to do that? We have to get people to decide to want to do that. We have to get them to feel safer doing that. So then we can start talking about things like perception. So psychologists, particularly cognitive psychologists, to the rescue again. So at some point, so here we are, traffic engineers need us to help make roads safer for everyone. At some point, someone noticed traffic slows down in tunnels. This is my hometown of Denver. This tunnel no longer exists. But this used to be one of the worst bottlenecks in Denver. Even it's the old Stapleton runways. It used to be great. You could be driving underneath the 747 as it went by. But these were terrible. You would slow down. It's called the tunnel effect. It's a well-known effect. People get into a tunnel. They slow down because they're in cramped spaces. So as a result, we tend to make roads nice and wide open, big, wide spaces that look open. This creates a lot of problems. So what do you think is safer? Is it safer to drive down this narrow tree-lined street or this nice, wide open street? People go fast down this street. People go slowly and more carefully down the narrower street because this is like a tunnel. This is essentially a reverse tunnel effect. By creating these big, wide open streets, we've made them less safe because people drive much faster than they're supposed to than they do on these narrower streets. Tree-lined streets, it turns out, are much safer. There's data behind this because it creates a tunnel effect. And so people perceive that as being safer. I took these, by the way, this morning as I was walking to the metro station because I had forgotten to do this earlier. So if it's hard to see, I apologize, but these are right by my house. Which of these two sidewalks would you rather walk down? The one right next to this car turns out these go past the same building because this sidewalk's going away eventually. So I kind of cheated here. But you can see this is the road, goes to the metro station. In my neighborhood, which is across the street from this, none of the sidewalks are right next to the street. There's always a row of trees next to that. Well, it turns out traffic engineers don't like pedestrians. And they probably wouldn't believe you when you say that, but traffic engineers tend to think that trees are things that cars will run into. And so they actually, in a lot of places, codes prohibit having trees right next to the roadway because cars will run into them. Much better to put a sidewalk next to the street because people are squishy. Nobody's going to hurt your Mercedes because, first of all, nobody walks down the sidewalk anyway. Everyone's driving. And so we don't put trees next to roads for that sort of basic reason. So basically there's a reverse tunnel effect. People drive faster when there's a sidewalk next to the road and not trees. And people feel less safe walking down a sidewalk that's right next to the street. So placement of things like sidewalks, trees, all of these are basic perceptual and cognitive effects that affect our behavior directly. In fact, there's a lot of data coming out about how things like walkable cities, places with biking, have very different kinds of infrastructure because of the way people feel safe or not. So if we're going to try to do things like create walkable cities, there's a huge role for cognition in this. So motivation is a key factor. In addition to people feeling safe, there has to be places for people to go to and from. People just don't go wandering about. There has to be a perception of safety. People have to feel safe walking. Here's where we start getting to this kind of neuroeconomics. Parking is there's a whole weird part of parking that I didn't understand until I read this book I'm going to show you here in a minute. But perception of scarcity, that is, if people think parking is scarce, they will take alternative transportation. And so there's this whole sort of science behind parking. In fact, they talk about Pasadena as being one of the places that's done it right because of where they have parking is away from Main Street. But there's enough that people can park, but not so much that you can always find a space. I don't know. One of the other interesting things, we were talking with someone about this earlier, is this kind of perception of time and distance. People will walk further if the scene changes. So things like block length affect how far it seems and whether or not the scene changes at all. And so if you're walking like past one very, very long building, it seems like forever. Whereas if like there's a street here, a park there, or some of the streets, place to look in, it seems much shorter. So people will walk further distances depending on the way streets are laid out, depending on the architecture at street level, depending on how much. There's all sorts of interesting variables that go into this. So this is how I ended up interested in all of this. There's this terrific bookstore in Washington, D.C. called Kramer's Books that gets a lot of my money because it's right by the metro stop I get on. But, it's a bookstore with a bar and cafe. So you can sit and drink and pick up books. It's like a perfect storm for me. So there's a whole bunch of metrics that increasing walkability improves health. That seems sort of obvious. But all of these kind of issues that I've just talked about were kind of raised by this book, or at least I took them and started to apply them on a cognitive perspective. So I want to take a look at some other recent examples where there actually is clear evidence that the world needed a cognitive psychologist, and this one happened to be perfect timing. This was about 2 weeks ago, last week or the week before. Came up right as I was preparing for this talk, but the DC Metro hired a cognitive psychologist. So apparently, Metro drivers were running a lot of red lights, and apparently somebody thought that was a bad idea. So in the subway system in DC, there's a lot of intersections, and it's a pretty crowded system, so the line I'm on, there's a train every 6 minutes, which is as close together as they can get without having safety issues. So it turns out that they were running a lot of red lights, and so they brought in Atticus Consulting Group. They had to go all the way to Canada to find a cognitive psychologist. They couldn't call me. So apparently you can form a consulting group. Maybe that's what we need to do. So these two professors of cognition and cognitive neuroscience came in to tell them it's attention related. Really, probably one of my cognitive students probably could have told them that it was a basic vigilance task that their metro drivers were unable to sustain their attention over time, and basically it was a question of mind wandering. We all do that, but I don't drive 1,500 people on a train. So and I'm not sure what solutions they ever came up with, but they basically said your drivers aren't sustaining their attention over time. So hopefully they came up with something for them to do. I don't know. I mean, I don't know what solution they came up with. Having never been in the cab of the metro train to see what you might be able to do to make it less boring. I know in like cross-country railroads, they actually have this sustained vigilance task where the engineers have to constantly press a button to keep the engine running so that they know that they're awake. And in other sustained attention tasks, so those of you who go through these scanners at the airport, there's a whole bunch of cognition research that's gone into that. In fact, the entire way that airport security is run has been changed by research in sustained attention. So it used to be one person sat at that scanner all day and did that all day, but it turns out their criterion for finding stuff in people's bags shifted over time, and so they shift them out every hour. They also now computer-generate images. So if you're one of those people that gets selected for additional screening, it's possible that the computer has placed an item, generated an image in your bag, which is basically how that works, and so it allows them to keep them on their toes so they're not rare targets, they're actually more common targets. This is all a basic sustained attention kind of problem. So this is one of the interesting, this one's a few years old, but recently, 4 years ago, the New Jersey Supreme Court wrote probably one of the best psych review articles on eyewitness testimony that I've ever read. The sweeping ruling on eyewitness testimony, and it reads like a psych review paper. But you haven't read psych review, it's a pretty prestigious journal. But this ruling from the New Jersey Supreme Court set down new rules for dealing with eyewitnesses. And it included things like the weapon focus effect, difficulties with cross-racial identification, the effects of stress, distance and lighting, confidence and accuracy, verbal overshadowing. I mean, it reads like a textbook on eyewitness testimony, and it was written by the New Jersey State Supreme Court. So there are lots of areas in which there are important applications of cognition, which is really our take-home message here. Kind of keep skipping through some of these areas of applications of neuroscience. We'll talk a little bit about the confluence of neuroscience and poverty. This is a new area that some work is being done here in California in combination with some places like University of Pennsylvania. So a variety of studies have begun linking poverty with brain development. And specifically, they found reduced volume in very specific brain areas, and these reductions have been linked to executive functions and language in particular. And so if you look, you can see high socioeconomic status kids have much higher gray matter than middle and low SES kids. And to give you an idea of how different these studies are, one of them had 1,099 MRI scans of kids. I've never read an MRI paper with more than 20. In fact, one of the things they had to factor in was, as part of their regression analysis, I think you were taking stats, one of their variables was which scanner the patient was placed in, because that was an important part of the variable. But almost 1,100 MRI scans. That's a lot of power. And so it's pretty remarkable and really pretty powerful piece of work. And I tried to select some other different things to talk about in terms of their application. Education policy is, of course, a huge area. This is one of the areas that I'm interested in. How do we better educate students? How do we better educate our students as psychologists? My students do weekly quizzes, cumulative exams, and they actually have told me they like them because they learn a lot more from them. Because once you test something, you're much more likely to remember it later. And there's some pretty good neuroscience evidence for that as well. So right after I moved to Montgomery County, Maryland, again, nobody called and asked me, they ended cumulative final exams in all their schools because there's too much testing. The problem is that there's too much testing, there's too much of the wrong kind of testing in schools. There is too much testing, but it's all bad testing. Whereas cumulative finals, which are trying to not only assess what students know, but also reinforces that material. In fact, there's a great deal of literature that shows that cumulative finals are very good for long-term retention. Improving study habits. I think if you wanted to form a company tomorrow and go out and start making money, taking Mark McDaniel's book, Mark and Roddy's book, Henry Rutherford, Mark McDaniel, and creating a basic company in which you go out and teach kids like at Sylvan Learning Centers how to study better, and teach their parents how to study better, I think you can probably make a pretty good buck and do those kids a pretty big favor, because there are much better learning strategies. My students still report, how many of you had teachers tell you that repeated memorization was the best thing to learn, that if you're going to learn something, repeat it over and over again? Yeah. I'm determined to kill that as a strategy, because it's the worst memory strategy there is. But we still teach students that, parents still teach their kids, but we have to get out, we have to get in communities, we have to get out and teach people that. And so figuring out a way to do that, you can figure that out, pretty good idea. Now I want to come out of the sort of less, I want to come out of the fun stuff that we've talked about and talk about a pretty serious topic that's been in the news. That I actually had my cognitive students write papers on. So I was teaching cognition at Clemson during the Ferguson incidents. And this is, of course, a serious problem. We're talking about things like officer-involved shootings, but there are a lot of cognitive issues involved on all sides of this issue. And I think as scientists, we can take a dispassionate view that's science-based and try to pick apart the problem in all of its pieces. And so here's a couple of examples of why this is a cognitive problem at its core. So pick it apart a little bit. We know that stress influences perception, attention, and working memory. And so anyone who's under a high degree of stress has supremely elevated cortisol levels, and as a result, they tend to get tunnel effects. They tend to perceive things differently. We also know that a lot of these incidents unfold incredibly quickly, and as a result, there's no time for conscious awareness or attention of what's happening because they happen so fast. And finally, we do know that there's a role of race in these incidents, because if you look at a variety of incidents, an officer is more likely to perceive a weapon in the hand of a black suspect. And there's a variety of research behind that. So how do we solve this problem? Well, we have to solve this perception problem for sure, and maybe that's through training. This is a question that is open, and that there is a lot of work to be done in, because this is an important question, because we want to make sure everyone's safe, officers are safe, that people on the street are safe, that we aren't misperceiving things that aren't the way they are. And so this is a question for a cognitive psychologist. And so these are the kinds of issues that you can tackle. These are important issues that we really need to think about, because I think it's something we need to think about. Now, other places you can look, lots of work being done in attention and cognition, in video games and computing. In fact, Microsoft has been recruiting at a lot of conferences. If you go to the APA careers website, there's some talk about that. But think of it this way. Does it involve perception? Does it involve attention? Does it involve memory? Does it involve decision-making? That's pretty much everything in life involves all of those things. If it involves any of that, then it's a cognitive psychology question. As a cognitive student, you are uniquely trained to identify those issues. And so these are important issues to think about. So how does this all come out in terms of finding a job someday? Well, a lot of this falls under the umbrella of what we call human factors work. Again, this is another great book. If you haven't looked at it, it's called The Design of Everyday Things. It was originally The Psychology of Everyday Things. But Don Norman's a cognitive psychologist. Pretty interesting stuff in there. He talks a lot about things like 3 Mile Island nuclear accident and why that was a human factors problem. Things like doorknobs. Has anyone ever walked up to a door and can't figure out how to open it? Yeah, got that problem. So he shows some pretty clear examples where you walk up to the door and you're like, why is there no door handle on this? Gabe and I actually got into an argument at a conference once about the elevator design and it being a bad design, and the guy next to me was like, no, it's perfectly clear. I'm like, no, it's not. It says down, but it has an arrow going up. This is what happens at cognitive conferences. We get into arguments about something. So these are some avenues that you might think of about exploring. I have a former grad student that was my TA, works for the the Federal Highway Administration. They actually have a drive sim lab in DC where they've got some really interesting papers about intersection design, cool stuff. NHTSA, which is the National Highway Transportation Safety Agency. FAA does a bunch of this work. If you want to make a lot more money, go to work for Booz Allen Hamilton or Deloitte. Lots of PhD psychologists go to work for these. You'll need a security clearance to work for most of them, but they hire lots of social, cognitive, neuroscience folks to do consulting for the military. Other places, I think places like DARPA. There's a human factors lab at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Or you just simply go on and work in an area that you're interested in that you can apply your trade to. So if you're interested in urban planning, you can go get a master's degree in urban planning, landscape architecture, all kinds of places that you could take and do really cool stuff. Some related programs to look at, the Center for Neuroscience and Society at University of Pennsylvania. Really terrific program. Martha Farah runs this program. Lots of really interesting applied work. The McCourt School of Public Policy at Georgetown is actually one of the only public policy schools that specifically teaches evidence-based practices. The basic idea is if we're going to institute public policy, you have to gather evidence that it's a good idea. So all the things we've talked about are testable in terms of their design and in terms of how we might work in these areas. So other places to look are, of course, human factors and applied psychology programs, interdisciplinary programs, all kinds of areas that you can go and do this kind of work. For some sort of final thoughts in this area, as we interface with technology more and more, we really need to understand the human element and how it's involved. And you've probably all had something that you've interacted with that has made you crazy, right? One of them I find that drives me insane is when they make one button larger on your interface on like your iPhone or something. Anyone ever notice that they hit that button a lot? Anyone know why? It's called Fitts Law. You've talked about this in any of your classes. Basically, Fitts Law is the distance you have to travel and the size of the object you're trying to point to. Your accuracy and your speed will depend on how large the object is and how far away it is. So larger objects are things you always go towards. And so you oftentimes will always hit that larger object, not to mention it just takes up more screen. But you can do things like design better interfaces if you understand how people interact. So the last thing I want to talk about is this isn't new. Psychologists have a long history of influencing public policy in ways that you probably never thought of. Anyone heard of this particular Supreme Court decision? You know that it was decided on the basis of social science studies saying that separate was inherently unequal. In fact, all of the opinion was written about using social science research. Pretty important decision. We no longer execute minors in this country because of frontal lobe development studies. And of course, we've already talked about the New Jersey Supreme Court decision, but there are a bunch of Supreme Court decisions that cite social science research, particularly psychology research. So, final thought here. I'll leave you with my last and very favorite quote of all time. Never doubt that a